When you go back to revisit old movies or TV shows, yeah, sure, you might have to pull out your dusty VHS or CD players, but once that good old-fashioned physical media is in there, you just gotta hit the play button and enjoy. Now with games, it's not as simple. By definition, games are an interactive medium, and the way that interactivity plays out has shifted and evolved a lot over the years. When you boot up a nice retro title, you may notice something terrifying. The controls are all fucking weird. What the hell happened here? I mean, I'm supposed to use left shift to jump? Reload is bound to L? Lately, I've been doing a little digging on something super niche. Probably not something that strikes most people as too notable. I'm talking about the history of video game control schemes. Specifically on PC, because that's where I make my home. What started all of this, you might ask? Well, my friends and I were playing the finals the other day, and we got into a little bit of a debate about what crouch button is better. You see, slide in that game is bound to C by default, and as a Titanfall enjoyer, I went to go rebind it to control, which started a little debate about which was the superior crouch key choice. We still haven't agreed to see eye to eye, but that led me into looking where our control schemes come from. It's something we very much take for granted nowadays. We boot up modern games, and we expect certain things. Even on titles that might have a couple of unusual or wonky keybinds, things like WASD and trigger and aiming controls are all very standardized. But where did this all come from? How did we get here, and which goddamn crouch button is better? In the realm of PC gaming, for a while it was kind of the Wild West of control schemes. With the early first-person games in the 90s, you could find titles with nearly any kind of control setup. Wolfenstein 3D arguably set the standard for using the arrow keys to move and look around, with left control, alt, and shift being used to shoot, strafe, and sprint. For a while, most of the popular first-person games followed in these footsteps. Doom, Heretic, Dark Forces, Witchhaven, and others still all used this scheme, and it worked pretty well. These titles didn't have vertical free looks, so it made sense to solely use the keyboard to play. Some people did opt to use a joystick or a mouse to move their camera, which is where we start seeing control schemes like ESDF, IJKL, HJKL, and the accursed DCAS. Something about that one just seems intensely wrong to me. Free look isn't the only thing these older games were missing, though. The majority of these titles also lacked the ability to crouch. Occasionally, you would see it pop up. Star Wars Dark Forces was the first game to incorporate crouching, or ducking, bound to the C key. At the time, using C to crouch made sense, as it was expected that the majority of players would already have a hand positioned in the left corner of the keyboard. But things were changing. Pro players began to discover that mapping your look controls to your mouse allowed for an insane degree of flexibility and control with aiming, now that the camera rotation wasn't on a fixed speed. Revelatory, I know. You may have heard of Dennis Fong, or as he's better known in the gaming sphere, Thresh. Considered to be one of the first pro gamers, he grew up playing Doom and would later become famous for his skills at Quake championships. This guy was stupidly good. He apparently once beat the UK Quake champion with 23 frags to 0. No one could come close to his skill. Thresh used the WASD control setup as it felt the most comfortable to him, while giving easy reach to other important keys. As he was blowing up in the late 90s, other tournament players, and eventually everyday gamers, began to copy his control scheme. In an interview at QuakeCon in 2016, Thresh would say this about his influence on popularizing the WASD control scheme. Quote, "I'm not sure I can take credit for creating it. I just picked what was comfortable for me, but, I think a lot of people give me credit for popularizing it because I was one of the only, if not the only, really well-known gamers at the time. I think a lot of gamers ended up adopting it, including people I used to compete against, and so I think that led to its popularity." End quote. And he was absolutely right. As Quake continued to gain popularity in the late 90s, his control scheme began to be seen all over the place. Everybody wanted to be efficient and cutting edge like Thresh, and the WASD setup started to be found everywhere in FPS tournaments. Going forward, games started to incorporate the WASD control scheme as a pre-made option, or even as a default a lot of the time. 1998's Half-Life is pretty much the biggest example here, with out-of-the-box controls mapped to mouse look, WASD, and control for crouching. Of course, Half-Life's spin-off titles like Team Fortress and Counter-Strike used these control schemes as well, and it looked like gaming had found its new crouch button for good. It would totally stay that way. Rainbow Six of the same year had... Wait, what? Okay, well, what about System Shock 2? What the hell am I looking at? Okay, world-famous Turok 2? Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. Okay, so I guess it still was kind of the Wild West of control schemes, even into the turn of the century. Taking a look at some first-person shooters from the early 2000s, it's clear that things were still a mixed bag. A lot of PC games were beginning to use the WASD controls, but many, if not most, also had arrow key controls as one of the primary options. There were games like Halo Combat Evolved that had a strikingly similar keybind setup to modern games, with really the only weird thing being that grenades were bound to right mouse and ADS/zoom was set to Z. Halo arguably was a huge influence on how to set up PC keybinds, but it seemed like even though WASD was quickly becoming universal for first and third-person PC titles, other inputs like sprint, interact, and yes, crouch were still kind of all over the place. Speaking of third-person games, let's take a look at some of the controls those titles had. In the early 2000s, there was a plethora of third-person releases. Just to name a few, we had Max Payne, Splinter Cell, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, all which used the typical WASD controls and C to crouch, with variable interact keys. But then you have games like Knights of the Old Republic, which used WZSC? Or The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, which had jump bound to E and interact with space. Devil May Cry 4, released in 2008, still didn't have controls bound to the mouse. Or perhaps Resident Evil 4, which had really weird key bindings. You're telling me you expect me to shoot with Enter in 2005? You expect me to sprint with the right shift? And I'm not going to even go into the weird tank controls. Games with super wonky key bindings were starting to become less common though. Sure, you still had some odd choices here and there. I've been replaying the Mass Effect series lately, and there are certainly some weird control schemes in those games. Past 2010 though, a lot of the variation you'll find with keybinds has more to do with what abilities the game itself calls for. As titles begin to have more public reach and the games industry continued to grow, it made sense that over time, people would begin to grow used to doing things a specific way. Of course, while many controls are still somewhat standardized today, things like crouch and interact keys still depend on the title. In my opinion, after digging through dozens of manuals and entries on PC game controls, I have to admit that perhaps there isn't a single crouch key to rule them all. It's probably safe to say that most titles default to the control key, but a large percentage of games mix it up a lot, and what you prefer most likely comes down to what games you grew up on. I grew up playing Bethesda games, most all of which default to control. I also put so many hours into Source games, titles that a lot of times required crouch jumping, and of course, shooters like Battlefield 4 and Titanfall. It's honestly pretty cool to see the journey of how controls started off with developers just kind of throwing shit at the wall and seeing what stuck, and over time, how controls have become so ubiquitous. The evolution of control schemes kind of mirrors the growth of the gaming industry itself, from the chaotic and innovative landscape of the 90s to standardization that has coalesced into a more cohesive and predictable form of gaming. It's super easy to take things like this for granted, especially since other mediums don't really have issues with how people have to interact to enjoy them. I don't really see PC controls evolving that much more in the future, except maybe for things like VR games, which are really just now becoming more mainstream. It does fascinate me though how players get so attached to forms of control that they've become used to. Whether that be the rare player who still likes using joysticks for PC games, to many of us who take pride in our silly little crouch key choices. The future may hold new innovations, but I'll still always be over here slide hopping with my control key. If you made it to the end of this video, then thank you. I apologize for any weirdness with my voice. I'm just now recovering from being sick for about a week, which I don't wish on anyone. So I hope you're all staying in good health, and thank you again for all of the continued support. If you'd like to see more of my stuff in the future, consider subscribing, and I'll see you around. Take care of yourself.
Who's that?
Oh, hi Greg. Hi Greg.
Hi. Here, I'm gonna come watch.
No!
Oh, that wasn't very fair. I saw that. That was pretty
Right
not
in the
fair.
middle. Right in the middle.